the Come Up with Katia, we've got Phil Steger, the founder and CEO of Brother Justus Whiskey, which is a single malt whiskey brand out of my hometown of Minnesota. I've got my Minnesota shirt I'm rocking today, the Dome. Are you a Vikings fan?
What's that?
I said, are you a Vikings fan?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, good.
Absolutely. But my daughter is she's a over-the-top Vikings fan.
Oh, I love that.
She was 8 years old, 7 or 8 years old, and we were actually in the panhandle of Florida during the Minnesota Miracle in a bar surrounded by Saints fans. And we were both wearing horns and braids. And when Stefon Diggs caught that ball and ran into the touchdown, she went to all of them and just was like, in your face, in your face. So she is out of control Vikings fan. No, we bleed purple.
I love how everyone still has a story about where you were for the Minneapolis Miracle. Who's your favorite player right now?
I mean, the easy answer is Justin Jefferson. He's the most exciting person. He's probably the most exciting player of the NFL as far as I'm concerned.
100%. I know. I'm still on a high from Sunday.
Yeah, it was unbelievable. We don't get those very often.
We don't.
We got to celebrate them. But we're kind of stacked with some great talent this year. I mean, the defense was super exciting.
And we're playing aggressive, which we did not do last year. It was like so timid last year.
Yeah. And
I'm gonna do a little plug for Vikings Weekly here. Check out our other show.
Sure. Hey, and we've actually got a couple of Eric Kendricks is actually involved in Brother Justus.
Is he really?
A little bit.
That's awesome. He's really embraced the Minnesota community.
What's that?
I said he's really embraced the Minnesota community, it feels like.
Absolutely. He's really, I mean, as a leader, both on and off the field around the stuff that really matters, especially in the wake of George Floyd. Minneapolis has been through a lot in the last few years, and he totally stepped up. And it was really cool to see.
So is Eric Kendricks a whiskey drinker?
He is.
Yeah. Okay. What's his favorite Brother Justus?
There's quite a few on the Vikings. Harrison Smith is probably the biggest whiskey drinker that I've heard about on the team.
Okay.
So there are quite a few. One, Anthony Barr, although unfortunately he's no longer.
Miss him. Yep.
Really miss him. Super good person. Also big whiskey drinker. We got to know each other actually because of me. Now a mutual friend. Brought a bottle of Brother Justus to a party at Anthony's place. It used to be his place anyway, in International Market Square. And he was like, "What is this? This is amazing. Who is this guy?" And then I got invited over to his place and put the whiskey in front of him. And
no way.
I'm really good friends.
That's awesome. That's a great story. So are they like investors in Brother Justus or just supporters? Okay.
Yep, they're investors.
Oh my God, I love this even more.
We're your home away from home. When you don't come home to go to St. Mary's, you got to come to Brother Justus.
Yep, 100%. Well, and you guys are in Northeast. I grew up in South Minneapolis and all around that whole area. We were just talking about, the Greek community and everything in that realm. So it definitely feels like home to me. Before we dive into the foundation of Brother Justus and your story and everything like that, I really want you to tell everyone who Brother Justus was, because he was a real person and it's not just some name that you made up. So give us your version.
Absolutely. He was a real person. He's a person almost nobody's heard of yet. But one of my missions is to make sure everybody knows who he was. He was a monk at a monastery in central Minnesota, a Benedictine monk during Prohibition. He was the Abbey blacksmith. And when he saw how local farm families were suffering under both Prohibition and the farm depression in the 1920s, he's like, hey, whiskey might be illegal, but it's not immoral. The only immoral thing is bad whiskey. And so he took it upon himself to use the Abbey blacksmith shop and built high quality precision whiskey stills and smuggled them onto his neighbor's property, like Kris Kringle or something, and then taught local farmers how to distill whiskey in a Benedictine style using Benedictine techniques, which are, centuries centuries old. Monks have been making spirits and liqueurs for half a millennium or more. And he did that so that farmers could turn grain, which at the time was worthless during the farm depression, into a safe, super premium, high quality product, whiskey, and use that to not just put food on the table, but save their farms and save their communities. And it became so successful. His only condition was that these farmers teach what he taught them to their neighbor.
Okay.
Because he's like, look, I'm giving you tools, I'm giving you knowledge. This isn't for your use alone. This is to benefit the whole community, and not to give you an advantage over your neighbor, but to allow you and your neighbor to lift each other up. And within a few years, there were 1,600 family-owned and operated illegal whiskey distilleries throughout central Minnesota. And they were producing the only moonshine of Prohibition that had a brand name.
Wow. And what was the brand name?
Minnesota 13.
Minnesota 13. Okay.
So it was the only whiskey sold and marketed by the place where it was made, as opposed to by the farmer who made it. Because in Prohibition, you want to know who you're getting your hooch from, right? I mean, you want to know, because it's rock. You don't want to get rock up whiskey that makes you go blind.
Well, that's the one thing where you mentioned it being safe. Like, that was a huge thing that people don't think about. Like, oh, back then it was actually extremely unsafe to be creating these, distilling these whiskeys and distributing it, not knowing what it was going to do to your body.
100%. Yeah. And that wasn't because people were bad. It's because they didn't have the right tools and they didn't have the right knowledge. The make you go blind and all the sort of neurological stuff, you know, the howling at the moon and all the crazy behaviors, that wasn't from people being drunk. I mean, I've been drunk before. I've been around drunk people. They don't do that. They don't go blind. You know what I mean? So it wasn't because of the alcohol. It was because people didn't have the right material for building their stills. The best material for a still is copper. It's clean, it's safe, and it actually helps with the distillation process, the chemistry. But people, what they had was galvanized tin. Because that's the roofing material. That's the roof of the shed. So you pull that roof off and then you fashion it into a still. The problem with galvanized tin is the galvanizing metal is zinc, which is a neurotoxin. They didn't know it, but it's a toxic metal. And they soldered it with lead. So it was actually like metal poisoning that was causing people to have the neurological problem, but people didn't know that that's what was happening. Yeah. And then the rot gut part was, they didn't have the right design of still and the right knowledge and technique to be able to refine the ethanol and the alcohol out of the base beer. And so when you do that, when you just sort of like evaporate out a beer, you know, distill it, and you don't refine it, you get kind of a potpourri of chemistry. Okay. And in some of the molecules actually cancel each other out from a flavor perspective, because there's both methanol and ethanol that comes off. Okay. And so you actually, even though you've got this incredibly potent chemical mixture, it actually tastes very neutral. And so people would buy, I would come to your house, Katia, and I'd be like, hey, I need some moonshine or whatever. You'd give me a jug, I'd sip it, and you're saying, you're trying to cheat me. You watered this down. Mm-hmm. It's actually toxic AF, but you don't want to lose the sale. So you go to the back shed, you get a little bottle of lye, a caustic material. You put a few drops of that in there, bring it back and say, oh, Phil, I can tell you've got a discriminating palate. You're not my ordinary customer. Let me give you the good stuff. I take a sip of that. I feel the burn all the way down. Mm-hmm. And it's actually what lye is doing. It's actually burning my esophagus and melting my stomach lining. But again, casual, but people didn't know. And even if they knew, they were desperate, like poor people in desperate situations. And it's like, I either lose this, you know, either make this sale or my kid doesn't eat. Right. Or prioritizing your kids over this stranger who came to your door.
So how did the Minnesota 13, how did the word of Minnesota 13
just
spread?
Quality.
Yeah. But how did it spread across the United States?
Several things. So the natural, you know, the biggest answer is that the Capone family,
I was going to say, mafia,
Chicago, they picked up that there was this incredibly high quality, delicious whiskey that was coming out of Minnesota. And so collaborating with the Irish of St. Paul, and the folks who are making this whiskey, Brother Justus was was of a German immigrant family. It's mostly German Catholic immigrants in central Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
And they were engineering this, using Brother Justus stills and techniques, family to family. One family teaches two teach four, right? You can see how this just spreads. And the quality of it, they've started to be able to make so much that the local market wasn't sufficient for all the supply. So people would go to Chicago, or they'd go to St. Paul, and they'd use their connections and try to get a bigger distribution network. And it eventually made it into the biggest distribution networks that were coming out of Chicago. And so there's textual and there is physical evidence showing that New Yorkers were drinking Minnesota 13, folks in San Francisco were drinking Minnesota 13. There's even Parisian nightclubs that printed handbills, right, for their clubs advertising Minnesota 13. They never did it, but that's how far the reputation as the best went.
Yeah.
It's kind of unbelievable.
That's amazing. And then you add in the waterways of Minnesota and how whiskey was distributed in Prohibition through the mafia. It's just like the perfect storm of creating this unforgettable brand, nation and worldwide, really.
It's really special. And one last thing, but it's also the only supply of whiskey that the mob never got control over. So
why did they never get control of it?
They tried.
Okay.
But here are some Italian Americans coming up from Chicago into central hill country of Minnesota, where they all spoke German. And there were so many, right? There were 1,600 families. Capone might get his men might get a few people to sort of say, yeah, all right, we'll sell our interest or we'll give you control. But he could never get the entire community.
Okay.
And I remember going to St. John's, which is in the heart of this country, the heart of this story, St. John's University. And I remember, there's a lake outside campus where an old timer, Francis Schellinger, pointed at the lake and said, there's a Model A Ford down there.
No way.
Yeah. I was like, what are you talking about? Yeah, there's a Model A Ford at the bottom of that lake. And it's like, where did it come from? Oh, it was one of Capone's men.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I was like, well, what happened? They got pushy.
So my LA brain now is spinning and like writing a whole pilot script right now in my head throughout this whole conversation about this story, because this is amazing. As you mentioned, you went to St. John's in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Is that where you first learned about Brother Justus as you're a theology major, right?
Yeah, it was. I mean, this is, it's the classic path from theology student to whiskey entrepreneur. It's been traveled many times.
Totally.
So many.
It's what every whiskey entrepreneur starts out as, is a theology student.
That's right. So yeah, I did study theology at St. John's. I was really interested in early Christian history, sort of like pre-imperial Christian history. And that's the incredible diversity of Christian history. It's so many languages, so many ethnicities, so many cultures. The Roman Catholic sort of identity is something that actually kind of came a little bit later. It was originally Aramaic and Greek, and then it became, and then it spread in every direction. And I was really fascinated with this. And I was really always been fascinated with the roles that monasteries also play in culture, and, both in the East and, but particularly, being a Westerner in the West, monasteries as these places where art and culture and knowledge and enlightenment is sort of pursued and then maintained, no matter what else is going on in the society around it. Which is really
interesting, because I don't think a lot of people realize that about monasteries. If you don't study it, or you're not of like Catholicism, Orthodoxy, anything like that, that's a really interesting fact that, that is one of their main jobs is to preserve culture in a way.
Correct. Yeah. And in fact, we owe the invention of whiskey to monks. Irish monks invented whiskey. Naturally, it was the Irish. They invented whiskey over 1,000 years ago when pilgrims, monastic pilgrims would travel to the Mediterranean and the Middle East. So Lebanon, the whole Lebanon, Greece, Italy, North Africa, was all this sort of like Hellenist world, right? And the world of Alexander the Great, which then became the Greek-speaking world and the world of learning. And they saw monks who were taking wine and then heating the wine and then cooling the steam from the wine into this clear, potent liquid. And they tried a little bit of it and they were like, this is awesome. We need to bring this back to Ireland. So this was, in the original distilled spirit was brandy. Brandy is distilled wine.
I didn't know that, actually.
So you take wine. All spirits is a distillation of a fermented beverage.
Right.
The type of spirit depends on the type of fermented beverage. The original being wine, originating in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. And the monks brought this back to Ireland, where they don't grow grapes and they don't make wine. They grow barley. They brew beer. They use the same method of, heating it up and then cooling the evaporated alcohol into a product. And they called it aqua vita in Latin, which means the water of life.
Okay.
Irish monks then brought that to Scotland, started monasteries in Scotland. Those monasteries kept distilling the water of life. The kings found out about it in about the 15th century and became big fans. And in fact, the earliest written reference to whiskey is essentially King James of Scotland setting an Uber Eats order to say like, hey, Porter, get a delivery of aqua vita, the water of life, from the monks of Llandaris Abbey. That is the very first written reference to whiskey as a takeout order, a delivery order. And then when, when King Henry VIII, after he split from the Catholic Church, started his own church, he started to shut down the monasteries because they were still loyal to Rome. Okay. Those monks had nowhere to go. They had to find a way to make a living. And some of them hired themselves out to the Scottish aristocracy as distillers. This that only the king used to drink, I can make this for you. You can be like the king and drink the water of life. That eventually, so that's how we get the origins of the early Scottish distilleries in these big estates that had their kind of in-house distillery. Wow. And when it came out of, once it no longer was being made in the monasteries where Latin was the main language, and it came out into the everyday vernacular secular life, in Gaelic, water of life is Whiskey Bay.
Oh my God.
So the word whiskey actually preserves this whole lineage of the invention of whiskey back to the Irish monks who invented it.
So when they were initially making the whiskey, the Irish monks, was the purpose to just create and enjoy it themselves, or was the purpose to sell it and create like a profit to run the monastery?
It was just for internal use, and it was considered a medicine. So that's why it was called the water of life. And I kind of love this because in ancient days, being healthy just was feeling good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Feeling healthy meant you felt good. And you have a dram of the water of life and you feel good. And we still feel good. And that's why they called it the water of life and used it primarily as a medicine. And then it became part of the ceremonial and celebratory and feast life, right? So the monks live very austere lives most of the time, but then on feast days like Christmas or Easter or other feast days, they would celebrate and have festivals and feasts. And so then it became to be used more and more in conjunction with that celebration and just the creation of community.
Okay.
And that's how the kings started to hear about it and say, well, I want some of those for my feasts. And that's how the whole thing got started. So yeah, I love that connection. I didn't actually hear about Brother Justus when I was at St. John's, but that's when I first started to understand and hear hints that, wait a minute, 100 years ago, I remember the day. It was actually a day like this, a beautiful September day in Minnesota. I was with an old Francis again, And he said, "Oh, a nice day in September. I bet my neighbors are cooking moonshine." And this is in the 90s. And I was like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So that back 100 years ago during Prohibition, every farm in this county had a whiskey still. And I thought he was just pulling my leg because he was just one of those guys that you never knew if he was like dropping deep wisdom or
Sure.
BS. But I kind of filed that away and I thought, is this real? And it wasn't until I had actually decided I want to start a whiskey company many, many, many years later that I was like, you know what? I need to explore this and see if this is real. And it was
so that conversation just re-popped into your head of
what
this is, because at St. John's, the monks make beer they've been doing it for years, right?
Yeah. I don't know if they still do, but certainly, 100 years ago, they were making beer, they were distilling brandy, they were making wine.
Yeah.
Liqueurs, for sure.
So you're at St. John's, you're a theology major, you're obviously very interested in culture and preserving history and ancient techniques. Yeah. What did you think you were going to do with that theology degree? Were you going to be a priest?
No, I wasn't going to. I knew that right away. I explored it, but not really. I actually never really did. I was like, no, because I really am. I have a deep connection to these traditions, but I'm just not somebody who can carry someone else's water.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Like, yeah. I just can't work for other people very well.
You're preaching to the choir.
So the whole chain of obedience from like a pope to an archbishop to a priest, I was like, I don't know. Celibacy seems like a stretch for me. Poverty, I never expected to have any money in my life. So that's easy. But I know for sure I can't do obedience.
Yeah.
And so that was never in the cards. Definitely wanted to have get married, have a family. But I did really want to be a part of making the world better and taking care of the earth, taking care of people, especially people who are born into difficult circumstances. Social justice was extremely important to me. Peacemaking was really important to me. And so after college, I actually, I actually managed and lived in a homeless shelter with homeless families.
In Minnesota?
Actually, this was in Washington State.
Okay.
And I did, and then also in Minnesota, I came back and did that with migrant families to make sure that not only did they have a place to stay and food and things like that, but a real relationship that was a human relationship as opposed to administrative relationship with a social worker, which is great, but not enough. Not enough for people who are in poverty. They need to really be cared for. And then from there, I got involved in peace activism and work, and actually then got involved in the Iraq situation.
What year was that?
This was in 2000.
Okay.
Before, when it was starting to be 2000, 2001, 2002, it was pretty clear that there was going to be a conflict in Iraq. And so I was part of a non-governmental nonprofit that was smuggling humanitarian aid into Iraqi hospitals, into the UN, so we were bringing food, we were bringing water purification systems, we were bringing cancer treatments and other medications into Iraq and getting them to people who didn't have them.
So you lived in the Middle East? I
didn't live there. I would do kind of humanitarian. We would do humanitarian trips in.
Okay.
And come back to the U.S., tell the story, raise money, gather aid, get support, and then go back in and try to get help to people who were the most vulnerable. Came back, did a lot of speaking about the really, really difficult humanitarian situation in Iraq, saying, yeah, Saddam Hussein is bad. We can get into all the politics of that, but let's not go to war. Let's find another way. I didn't succeed. That didn't work. Went to war. I then led a peace organization for 5 years. That violence training, and in prisons, for people that, were trying to turn their lives around. And then also a lot of speaking on international conflict and peace issues.
So when you were doing all that, what was like the proper way to tell the story of these individuals to Americans and other people that are like, can't even fathom what this is?
Great question. And you said it, you said the word, it's the most important word for me, and that is story. That's what you do. You tell the story. That I really felt a deep obligation, like, going through pediatric cancer hospitals in Iraq and Baghdad or Basra, and seeing and meeting children and their families who are gonna die because they're sick, they have cancer. There were sanctions, UN and United States sanctions on the country at the time, and so they were not going to get the treatments that they needed. We were bringing in what we could. So it became a really sacred obligation, I felt, to listen and be present, and then as best as I could, tell that story, name names, say, this is Kamal, he was 12. We talked about this. This is what he cared about. This is what he asked. This is what was happening to him and his family. And then always start from there, and then start to tell the story of history. So you go from the story of a person to a story of a people. Okay. And everyone can relate to that, because stories are how people become a people. Like, that's what make a people, is the stories. Like, you and I share stories about being Minnesota Vikings fans. Like, that is a very particular kind of experience.
Heartbreak.
Yeah. But that makes us like, we're part of a people now, because we have a set of shared stories that we can tell each other and immediately know, we just met, Katia and I, but we get each other. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. We get it. And so it's the same sort of thing. And that's what I did. Like, I told stories. I would tell a individual historical story, like this person's story, and here's the story of Iraq and this people inside Iraq, and this is the American story. We get it, we see it from this side. This is how they're experiencing it. Let's find a way to stand on the same ground and solve our problems together. Right. And it's always going to be idealistic. There's never a simple answer, but I still believe that is really the best and possibly the only way for us to make a better world. Yeah, absolutely. So is that what led you to law school? Like, that experience? Yeah, more, almost. There's one more. There's one step. I know. Because I'm thinking back to you saying, I don't like to work for somebody. And in my mind, I'm like, well, if you're a lawyer, you're signing yourself up to work for, like. Yeah, you're getting it. Wow, that's very sharp, because so I actually did one more thing before I went to law school. And one of the monks that I worked for studied with at St. John's, Father Columbus Stewart, he was developing this project at St. John's to digitize, so take digital photography of every page, binding, cover of ancient and historical manuscripts that exist. In the world? In the world, starting with the most endangered. Which is the Middle East, right? Okay. So we, in small Christian, indigenous minority Christian communities in the Middle East. So Assyrian Christians in Iraq, in Syria, Syriac Christians in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, southeastern Turkey. A very interesting and a very interesting group of Syrian Greek Orthodox Christians in places like Aleppo, Syria. And so he, as a monk, a Benedictine monk, he has all of these ancient, early roots that predate all the divisions and the schisms. And he is somebody that speaks about 12 or 13 languages. Wow. And so he's like, look, we've identified these manuscript collections. This was in 2007. So the invasion of Iraq had happened. The war was, there was still not stability in Iraq. The chaos was going into Syria. ISIS was on the rise. He's like, the clock is ticking for some of the oldest and most important manuscripts connecting us to an entire history of people that's not that's not the West, right? That's not the Latin side of things or even the Greek side of things, but this is. And so he's like, I need to get in there. We need to build a bunch of relationships, and we need to photograph thousands of these manuscripts in Aleppo, in Homs, in Beirut, southeastern Turkey, Lviv, and Kiev, Ukraine. And so for 2 years, that's what I was doing. I was rescuing manuscripts.
So he obviously recognized the problem of these ancient artifacts potentially
gone forever,
disappearing forever. Yeah. What was his connection to find how to save them, being like in central Minnesota? How do you go from central Minnesota to Syria and do it safely?
The answer is monks. I mean, here we go. We're back at it. So he is one of the world's leading scholars of early Christian monasticism, and he has both the scholarly and the religious credentials as a monk to build relationships with other monks in the Middle East and scholars in the Middle East and Ukraine. We were also in India. We were working in Georgia, trying to work in Georgia, Iraq, also Mali. So he had those relationships and just patient relationship building and trust. And so the method was, you will never give anyone your manuscript. We are never going to take your manuscript from you. We will never have custody of your manuscript, because that's been done before. Mm-hmm. There are manuscripts in the Vatican and British Library that people said, hey, we just want to take this back to our place for a minute. We'll bring it right back. And they never came back.
Don't get the Greeks started on the marbles of the Parthenon. You'll never get out of a conversation if you start the marbles of the Parthenon. I'm telling you right now.
that's a great tip. But yeah, so his method was, you hire the people you trust to do the work. We will pay that person's salary. We will provide you the equipment. We will train your people that you pick on the equipment that we pay for and provide. So we will never touch your manuscripts.
Okay.
You will only be the ones to control it at all times. And we will take digital photographs. You'll get a hard drive with every image, and we'll take 2 hard drives out of the country. One is at St. John's, and then one is in a vault in a mountain in the middle of the country.
Wow.
And so that's what he did. And my job was to, after he had built those relationships, be a part of the ground team that would manage the border crossings and manage the logistics and the relationships, and then getting the hard drives out, which wasn't easy, in Syria.
And you were there on site.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
And so now it's completely tragic, but I was in Aleppo in 2007, 2008, and that city is not the same city.
Right.
People that I met are no longer alive, and churches that we were in and monasteries we were in no longer stand, and the manuscripts that we photographed are gone. The only copies are these digital images that are now on hard drives and now on the internet. The St. John's uploads the images with permission of the custodians and the owners, mm-hmm. uploads them so that scholars anywhere in the world can read these manuscripts. And that's not only incredibly important from a scholarly perspective. In the diaspora, right, in the scattering of the people, if you have your stories, if you have your books, you can still be you.
Yeah.
You're just you're still you, your people. You're just your people in a different place. If you don't have those books after a generation or 2, if you don't have those stories, you become a different people.
Right.
That people that existed is gone.
Right.
So we have a lot of hope and a lot of hope and a lot of belief that, not only will scholars be able to unlock human history by reading these manuscripts, but the remnants and the survivors of these communities will be able to continue to teach their stories and teach their traditions and pass on their pass on their identity as the people to new generations.
So when you were there, obviously it sounds like, of course, it's a very like emotional experience, and you're really in a trusting experience because they're allowing you to continue to tell their story from an outsider's perspective as well, which we know many times can get diluted, or the whole telephone game of everything. So it's definitely like a big trusting aspect. What was something that was extremely surprising for you to learn, about yourself in those moments of going through that process?
I think that no matter how hard I tried to sort of be completely open and completely humble, we carry around all this unconscious arrogance. And it's not evil. It's just a consequence of living where we live and the culture we live in, and assuming that that's what's real. Like that's the standard. Whatever I know is the standard by which everything else should be judged. And I was pretty good. It was actually a really important part of my upbringing and my life to step outside that. I grew up in the southwestern Minnesota on the prairies, and my parents made sure I understood that was Lakota country. That was Lakota land. Like we were new people, a different culture, still lived there, had lived there for centuries, very well, thank you, before any of our ancestors immigrated over from Austria and other places of Europe. So my parents were really good about bringing me up that way. But even still, just having such as much as I studied and as much as I even already traveled in the Middle East, my view of the world is still super simplistic. And I just had to continue to confront. I would make assumptions. I would sort of like make little shortcuts of saying, oh, well, that's just like this. And I would constantly, my mentor, Father Colombo, would say, nope, that's not right. That's not actually, it's more complicated than that. And so I just had confronting that. And yet there's commonality, even though there's complexity and there's difference and there's diversity. At the same time, there is this absolutely core human experience and core human, I believe, spirit that you can find in anyone, anywhere, at any time.
For sure. Yeah, and I'm sure you still kind of carry a lot of those stories from those individuals like with you today, not only personally, but into Brother Justus and everything else you do in your life, I would assume.
Yeah, no, that's what motivated me to do this. We're now at the point where my life took a very, very strange turn, but it makes sense to me in light of what I just of these prior experiences. The manuscript work was really profound. Doing the humanitarian work in Iraq was really profound. And what kept drumming into my head was the importance of story and the lengths that people will go to tell their story, and to make sure their story is told. I remember being in Baghdad in 2000, when the country was still devastated from the Gulf War, absolutely impoverished by a decade of sanctions. And I went to a book market, on the street, where middle class and educated people were selling their books because they had no other means of getting cash. The economy was just devastated. So that's a very difficult place to tread. You want to be able to buy books because that's a way to give people money. You want to be part of the culture. You don't want to be patronizing. So you don't want to make a big ostentatious show of, oh, this book, you're asking $1 for this book. Here's $1,000 for your book. You know what I mean? It's a really delicate chance to make sure that I'm honoring the dignity of the people involved. And I remember, there were all these books, novels, great condition, that were selling for a couple of bucks. And then there was this battered paperback history called by George Antonius, called The Arab Awakening. And the seller was asking like $20 for it, equivalent. And I'm doing what I think I'm supposed to do, which is bargaining. Right? That's, you go to the market, you got to bargain.
Yep.
So I'm bargaining, and he's like, no, he's not moving. And I'm like, okay, well, he's just playing,
Then we walk away. Yeah.
Yeah, I dig in, and he gets more and more agitated, and a crowd starts to form around us. And I'm not understanding anything that's happening right now. I'm trying to say, here are these novels that are in great condition, paperback and modern, hardback and modern. And you're asking this for that, and here's this battered paperback, and you're asking 10 times as much. And he's getting angry and angry. Finally, somebody who a very educated person who spoke incredible English, thank God, because my limited Arabic was not getting me anywhere. And he's like, you are misunderstanding this completely. I'm like, well, just tell me. I don't mean to. I don't mean to cause offense. He said, these are novels. They're stories that are the invention of one person's imagination. This is our history. This is the story of what actually happened, not just in the imagination of one person, but in the real lives of millions of people. Mm-hmm. We don't sell that cheap.
I love that. There's like such a pride to that.
Yeah. And that is more than anything lodged in me and said, oh, the story of a people is the most valuable thing that they have.
Yeah.
You can never feel, never again can you bargain with somebody over the value of their story.
Mm-hmm.
And the manuscript work was just an extension of that, because here are people that are kept alive, manuscripts that are 1,000 years old. They're made out of animal skin, crushed flowers, and crushed minerals. These are not stable medium, right? Like that's food. That's right. Stuff that disintegrates and decomposes in a heartbeat. So how does this survive 1,000 years when, how many buildings of steel and stone survive 1,000 years? Only a handful. And so I remember Father Columba telling me, he was like, Phil, do you know why these manuscripts survive? I was like, well, I don't really know. Like, I said, because they're cared for and they make copies. So what are those manuscripts? They're prayer books, they're song books, they're scriptures, and their history. Those are the ones that survive, because those are the ones that are copied, and those are the ones that are cared for. So that when the flood comes, or the drought comes, or the invading army comes, they're the ones that get shoved in the backpack or put on the cart when you leave, and all the other things you leave behind. Mm-hmm. Because if you carry this with you, if you carry a prayer book with you, then you can gather a group of people around you. You can pray together, and you are a community again. Songbook, same thing. You can sing the same songs. You can share those memories. And so those are the ones that survive. And I remember being so deeply moved by that when saying, I want to be a part of, and this is the big change, not just a preserver of other people's stories, but I want to create and carry forward a story from my place and my history, and tell the story of my land and the thing and my community.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so interesting you say that too, because if you think about, the environment that was in, the point, not the end all be all point, but what happens in a war-torn environment is the separation, the separation of communities and peoples and individuals. Right. And that's how you break down a society and quote unquote win a war. That's the whole thing. So if you're keeping these scriptures and these stories of communities and what their foundation is together, how many countless stories are there of groups of individuals who have just been like, no, we're good. Like we just had 9/11 a couple of days ago, that the one plane, I can't even tell you the right one, but the one that was like, no, we're not going to just let you take over the cockpit like the other two, like we're going to come together. Yeah.
We're going to come together. There was enough time and people were starting to understand and get the reports of what was happening elsewhere. And they were like, oh, we got to do something.
Right.
And whatever happens, we're going to save people. We're going to save lives. And they're incredible heroes. If we, you said something about the dispersing of people. that's what happens in war and dispersing stories. Let's look at, Russia and Ukraine. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia started with the story that Vladimir Putin was telling, that Ukraine is not a country. Ukraine is not an identity.
Mm-hmm.
Ukrainians are not a people. They're just parts of Russia. They're just a lost part of Russia. They're not actually Ukrainians. And so it's all about who tells the story of who is a people and who isn't a people.
Right.
And the Ukrainians who are fighting back are saying, I might speak Russian, I might be Russian Orthodox, but I'm Ukrainian. Ukrainian is an identity. This is a land, this is a people. And you're not just going to erase us from history.
Right.
So this is the stuff that people, this is the heart of what makes us who we are.
Yeah. So you are like, all right, I want to tell this story of my land, preserve all of this. Where initially does your head go of how to tell that story?
It was a very specific minute. My wife and I had actually, it was back in 2008. So it was in the midst of the manuscript work. My wife and I visited a monastery in Kentucky. And my wife is also, she's a community organizer, works in faith-based community organizing around social, racial, economic justice, gender justice. And we went to this monastery. It was an awesome experience, very meaningful. We're driving out and we see a sign to a distillery, a bourbon distillery. We're like, let's check it out. And we're going through the tour. And I remember the tour guide saying, because I didn't really know, I was drinking whiskey at the time, I was drinking bourbon. And I didn't really know how whiskey was made. I didn't know where it came from. I figured it comes from a whiskey tree. I had no idea.
From a bottle, yeah.
It comes from a bottle, exactly. And so he's taking me through this tour, and he's like, okay, so here's this big vat. We take a bunch of grain, mostly corn, a mixture of corn, rye, barley, wheat, and we grind it up and we put it in hot water. And then we drain that sugary water and we ferment it into a mash. I was like, mash? That's beer. Like, yeah, we call it mash because it's mostly corn and that's kind of historical, but yeah, it's beer. I was like, whoa, I didn't know that whiskey started as beer. And I'm thinking, well, gosh, Minnesota, we make a lot of really good beer in Minnesota. And I'm just thinking, I mean, you know how it is. If you're from Minnesota, you're constantly comparing everything done in every other state to what we do in Minnesota and how to do it better. And nobody knows. So that's exactly what's going through my head, is this Minnesota chauvinism of just like, okay, you're making a beer, cool. And he's going on and on about the water. Oh, in Kentucky, we have these, limestone aquifers where we get this great water. I'm like, you're trying to tell me?
Yeah, you're gonna talk about water, like, So yeah. Oh, for cute. Yeah.
Tell me about our 10,000 lakes, the headwaters of the Mississippi, the western shore of Lake Superior. Let's have a conversation. Let's talk water.
Well, it's interesting in that time period too, because if I remember correctly, 2008, 2007, that was also the time period in Minneapolis that the craft beer scene was really turning a dime over there. So it was top of mind because liquor has never been, except for prohibition and continuing on, has not been our thing, which we'll definitely get into. But
no, you're absolutely right. That is a great callback to that, because that's exactly what was happening. Summit was really booming.
Fulton, all of those.
Yeah, it was a really exciting time, and I was excited about what was happening in Minnesota beer, and I was thinking, okay. And then he's like, well, and here's the still, and here's where we evaporate the mash into a vapor, and then we condense that vapor. And I'm like, whoa. That sounds like rain. You're making beer rain? And he's like, what? Yeah, beer rain. You're starting with like a little lake of beer, you're turning it into a cloud, and then you're cooling off that cloud, and then you're collecting the drops. That's rain. He's like, yeah. I was like, whiskey is beer rain? Like, this is literally how my thought process is going. And he's like, I guess so. And then he's like, and then we age it, put this whiskey, the new make, and I was like, the beer rain, into these barrels. And then these barrels are made of oak. And on the inside of this oak, we char them, and there's sugar inside the oak. Wait, what? There's sugar in wood? Yeah, I had no idea. And when you
I didn't know that either.
When you char the oak, the sugar liquefies and caramelizes. And I'm like, stop. Because I had actually done a little work in a restaurant in St. Paul. It was the 128 Cafe right by St. Thomas.
Okay. Wait, what's it called?
128 Cafe.
Oh my God, I used to go there all the time.
Yeah.
That place is amazing.
And it was Stewart's, and now it's Gus Gus.
I lived above it.
Way.
I lived above 128 Cafe, and let me tell you, Saturday mornings, their brunch and their bacon would seep into my apartment. So I'm like hungover, oh my God, I just need bacon.
That's incredible. So I worked in the kitchen. It was desserts and salads. And what we would do, one of my jobs was to put the brulee on top of creme brulee, right? So you have the crystallized sugar, you use the blowtorch, and then it melts and it caramelizes. So I say to this guy, "You mean it's oak brulee?" And he's like, he hates me. He wants me.
He's like, "This is the worst tour ever. Please leave."
You're the worst. And I'm like, so in my head, I'm like, whiskey is beer rain oak brulee. Like that is, and I'm like, and oak, Minnesota has the northernmost native white oak forest in the continent.
Where do they live in Minnesota?
St. John's, like
St.
right
John's,
Minnesota. Yeah, central Minnesota, where all this prohibition activity was happening, all this was happening, are where you have native white oak forests. And it turns out there are barrel cooperages in central Minnesota making whiskey and wine barrels, and have been for 100 years. I didn't know this at the time. So in my head, my mind is just going water, grain, right? Growing up in southwestern Minnesota, which is the eastern edge of the Great Plains with the deepest soils and, the most fertile agricultural soils on earth.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we can grow us some grain. We got water. We have the northernmost native white oak forests. And it just started to click. And then I'm thinking about this last ingredient, which is not a part of American whiskey tradition, but is a part of Irish and Scottish whiskey tradition. And that's peat, right?
Okay, so what is peat?
So bogs, when you've got a bog or a swamp, it's the decomposed. So just the natural plant material that at the end of every growing season, it dies, it lays down, and it doesn't decompose because the waters are too acidic and there's not enough oxygen.
Okay.
Minnesota, so peat bogs are very famous in Ireland. It's the turf, right? The turf fire, the smoky whiskeys out of Scotland, like from Islay, Lafroig, Lagavulin, that's all from peat smoke. They get the peat out of the ground, start it on fire. The smoke then smokes the barley that you brew into a smoky beer, and then you distill into a smoky whiskey. And so my head just goes to this place, and Minnesota has 6 million acres of peat bog. We have more peatlands than Ireland and Scotland. We have more peatland than any state in the country except Alaska. And we have far more of it per square mile than any other state in the country, including Alaska. So I knew that because I took a year out in college and lived off the grid north of Lake Superior in a little cabin and cut ski trails across peat bogs and for an outfitter. So I was like intimately familiar with Minnesota's peat bogs. So in my head, I'm just like water, grain, water from the upper Mississippi, grain from the eastern Great Plains, white oak from the eastern hardwood forest, and peat from the boreal forest. Minnesota is the only place where all of the continent's biomes meet. The boreal forest, the eastern hardwood forest that comes from the Atlantic Ocean, the Great Plains that come all the way from the Rocky Mountains, and then the headwaters of the Mississippi, which drains out the Gulf of Mexico. We are the ecological heart of the country. We're the only place where you can stand and touch the entire continent, right?
Wow. Yeah.
And have access and be a part of the continent's ecosystem.
The story of America.
It's the story of the country. It's the story of our land. And I was like, and it just started to turn in my head. I was like, this is the story I'm here to tell. Because I grew up on the prairie. I went to college in the oak woods. Mm-hmm. I worked and cut ski trails in the boreal forest. people who aren't from here don't know what that feels like to be a part of these big ecosystems that extend. When I grew up in the prairie, I could look west towards South Dakota and imagine the Rocky Mountains on the other side. When I would go into the woods, I could imagine that wood going all the way across to the Atlantic Ocean. And then you go up north and we're connected to Canada, Scandinavia, and Russia all through this vast boreal forest. You just get this innate feeling of, even though you're in this small place, you're connected to this much, much bigger world. And that's when I was like, this is what I need to put into a bottle. And I didn't know practically how to do that.
Yeah.
At the end of the tour, at the end of the tour, I actually said, we were getting my wife and I, Lisa, we were having our little sip, our complimentary drink at the end of the tour, and I'm sipping on, and I'm looking out. And I'm also looking at this valley. I'm saying, man, this looks a lot like the Avon Hills of central Minnesota. This looks a lot like wooded hills, grain-filled valleys, little rivers going through the bottom. Like, this looks like Stearns County. And I just said, I thought it was in my head, but I blurted it out loud. I was like, I want one of these. And the tour guide, he had enough. And he goes, sir, you only get one complimentary beverage at the end of the tour. I'm sorry, that's all I can serve you. And I'm like, no, bro, no, man.
Bigger picture.
I mean, one of these. And he's like, you have to figure that out for yourself.
He's like, everyone says this too. When they're like,
everybody says that. Yeah. And I'm sure that's true. And it's weird, but this is what I then set my heart to try to figure out how to build. And it took a long time. And in the meantime, my wife and Lisa then, became pregnant with our first daughter. And I'm like, I can't pin their futures and their security on a whiskey pipe dream. I also can't keep traveling around the world for nonprofit work and that sort of thing. I need to make a living. Like, I got to provide here. And so I thought, all right, I'll go to law school, because if I go to law school, then I have a trade. Like, then I can, if I want to, hang out my old shingle, work for myself. I could go into policy. I could go into politics. I could go into nonprofits, but be equipped as a lawyer. So it's like, this is just, law is just going to be a tool that I can use no matter what comes.
Right. I mean, especially if you're thinking about opening a business, you always need a lawyer.
Huge. We've saved hundreds and hundreds of thousands.
Yes.
So I go to law school. Lisa didn't know that law was my plan B at the time.
That's a fun convo.
Because in my head, this whiskey distillery thing, that was my plan A.
Okay.
This was now taking shape, because I'm looking at the beer market, and this was before the craft spirit boom, but I'm looking at the craft beer boom, and I'm just thinking about my own thought process and saying, where did craft beer come from? It came from beer drinkers and, younger beer drinkers, Generation X at the time, and then into millennials, saying, I don't want to drink the same beer over and over again.
Right.
There's more to life than Bud Light. And so they're seeking new experiences. They're seeking new flavors. They want authenticity. They want to hear a story of they don't want, just some generic, story that could apply from anything. They want to hear about your brewery in your hometown. And I thought, eventually people are going to wonder what's beyond beer, like I, and they're going to realize that what's beyond beer is whiskey. And so the craft whiskey boom is coming. I need to figure out how to be ready for it. Mm-hmm. That's sort of how it started. And I just started to research what whiskey would tell the story I would want to tell, what whiskey would create flavors that I want to taste, and what whiskey would have a chance to become a new iconic American identity.
So to take like a tiny step back away from your story and the greater story of like whiskey in Minnesota, what was missing? What happened in the gap of, as you mentioned, Minnesota has this unbelievable agricultural rich land that creates this amazing product. So we have Minnesota 13, we have all the natural resources, and then there's this gap of like, okay, this goes away. And then Kentucky shines.
Yeah.
in this whiskey movement.
Yeah.
Why did Minnesota lose this great momentum of an amazing product? And Kentucky's like, hey, like, let me slide in and
Yeah.
be the number one.
Well, to give Kentucky credit, I mean, whiskey in America really started in West Virginia with Irish and Scottish immigrants who moved there, and they started to make their homebrew in West Virginia, and then it spread west into Tennessee and Kentucky. So they have a legitimate claim to deep whiskey tradition. They didn't just appear on the scene late. I don't want any bourbon heads.
We're starting some fights here.
Yeah. So that's legit. It's absolutely valid, absolutely earned. You asked a really, really good question. It's like, and it was the question actually you reminded me that when I was at this bourbon distillery in Kentucky, I'm like, why isn't there a Minnesota Jack Daniels? Why isn't there a Minnesota Jim Beam?
Why is there not a Minnesota 13 still? Like, that makes actually no sense.
Exactly. So what happened is precisely because it was so distributed and so small. So 1,600 individual family distilleries is a really small, labor-intensive, right? High cost of goods sold. You cannot get economies of scale at that small family farm operated level. And the very thing that kept it independent of the mob and kept it from being wiped out by the feds too, its decentralization, is what made it super vulnerable when whiskey was legalized.
Okay.
It made sense that the prohibition actually put a premium on whiskey, right? It was the crime price. The fact that this is illegal then means you can charge a higher price for it. That made it profitable for you as a small farmer.
Okay.
Farm to glass distillery. When it was legalized, the fact that only the mob and those distilleries that the mob had control over the supply of were able to then make that jump in scale.
Okay.
Small scale to commercial scale.
Because of course it's a huge cash endeavor that you need liquidity for.
Huge cash endeavor. The startup capital and working capital requirements are insane. If I really had known the full extent of these, and I kind of kept myself deliberately ignorant about it, if I had known how much capital it would require, I'd be like, I'm not doing this. Yeah. I'm glad I didn't know. It was a happy ignorance, but yeah, and that's why. So when it was legalized, and the other thing is, states and the federal government then, under the influence of mob money, and then passed laws that really highly regulated and created huge barriers of entry to any new and small independent producer.
Oh, I was going to say, so the Minnesota strict liquor laws did play into that.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Because I mean, if anyone's listening that's not from Minnesota, it was like 5 years ago that we could start buying booze on Sundays, or alcohol on Sundays. You could buy it in restaurants, but it was like noon, 11 or noon or something. And then you could not buy it on Sundays. You have to drive to Wisconsin. We've all been there. Hudson, Wisconsin probably saw such a decrease in liquor sales once that law was changed. I
know for a fact they did.
Yeah.
Still Minnesota's laws are among the most strict. And it was this combination of moralism and then money lobbying and special interest that kept these laws super strict. Up until 5 years ago, the annual licensing fee for a distillery in Minnesota, whether you made 1 gallon or 1 million gallons a year, was $30,000. So if I wanted to make 1 gallon whiskey, I would have to pay the state $30,000 just for the right to do it every year, not just once, but every single year.
Wow.
So that's what kept, that's why small farmers, they couldn't possibly make a go of it, right? So they stayed underground. And it got them through the Depression and was still a really, really important part of the Great Depression economy of Minnesota, and why central Minnesota farms didn't suffer as much as other farms in the state. But then after that, in the post-war boom, it was just completely left behind and it stayed underground. And there are still moonshiners, people still drink Minnesota 13. It's just at family events, baptisms, weddings, and these sorts of things. And
so I'm assuming you've had it?
Nobody divulges their supplier.
Okay. But have you had Minnesota 13?
I will neither confirm or deny, because if I had, it would be illegal, and I don't.
Oh yeah, and you're a lawyer, so we can't go there.
Absolutely. So that's what happened, and so it was this really, when I started to understand this, and here's where, like, I think as an entrepreneur, I think you absolutely have to have humility, and humility is nothing but realism. I don't think, false humility is not realistic because it's over exaggerating what you might lack. But real humility is just realism. It's just being honest about what you know and what you can do and what you're good at and what you're not good at, and just being honest about it. So I was very humble in that sense, just being really realistic. But I did have this crazy, audacious idea that, Minnesota doesn't have an iconic world-class brand of whiskey. I'm going to make it.
Yeah.
And that remains my conviction. We're on the way to, I really believe Brother Justus is going to be on every discriminating whiskey shelf, not just in the United States, but in the world.
So where does Brother Justus come in, that he is this figure and representation of the story? Like, Minnesota story, of course, I get that side, but like, there's definitely, of course, a personal connection of he's your guy.
He's the guiding star. He's the North Star. He's the example to follow, right? Which is, we don't make his recipe of whiskey because Minnesota 13 was the whiskey made by people who in poverty to pull themselves out of poverty. Sure. And so their ingredients were corn and raw sugar, because that was the cheapest source of sugar that they could get their hands on to make the mash and then distill that mash or that beer into whiskey. That's no longer a constraint. And so I don't feel bound by that constraint of starting ingredient. What I do feel bound by is the constraint of ethics and authenticity and absolute commitment to the highest standards, which aren't lowered for anyone or any reason.
How do you remain with those ethics when, as we've mentioned, it's like an extremely expensive business to just like be like, I'm going to start this and I'm going to create the best product? Like, that's a pretty daunting task to go from these are my standards and I'm going to stick to it.
Yeah. It's my job. I mean, that is as the founder of this distillery, as the CEO of the distillery, that is my number one job. I really feel like my role as an entrepreneur is to lead a migration. There's another country, there's another future than the one that we're living in today. Mm-hmm. And this other future has some beautiful things in it if we can get there. And we need to remain ourselves on the journey. If we come through this migration, when we get to the other side, we're not who we were when we started it. What was the point? That's not a migration. That is a dissolution. That's a disintegration. And that means I have to lead people. I have to be completely honest. I have to be completely forthcoming and utterly credible and trustworthy when I say, this is where I believe the future lies, in an American single malt whiskey distilled from Minnesota ingredients, meaning we're using 100% malted barley. We're not messing with corn. We're not messing with these other materials. We're making single malt, like Scots, like the original Irish and Scottish monks, and the origin of whiskey. We're going to make that here in Minnesota, not to express a Scottish identity, but to express an American identity, to put this land in its vastness in a 2-ounce pour. That's what our mission is going to be. And people are going to want that. They're going to taste it and they're going to want to have it again and again. They're going to go back to a bourbon. They're going to reach for another single malt. And they're going to be like, yeah, that was nice, but I need that flavor again because that's something I've never tasted before. That's a whole landscape I've never wandered through before. And so it's my job to know exactly what that tastes like, and exactly what that feels like, and what it looks like, and how it envelops, and how it unleashes the person's imagination, and make sure that our product and our processes, our distillation techniques get us to that result. And then to be completely honest about how hard that's going to be and how long it's going to take and how many temptations there are going to be along the way to stop the migration and just cut out, and let's stop making our own whiskey from scratch. Let's do what everybody else does and buy whiskey from a mega distillery in Indiana and let's put it under our label and our bottle. And we won't lie, but we'll definitely be cool with it if people think we made it, even if somewhere in the fine print it says that we only bottled it. I'm just like, why would I put effort and why would I put my life and my family's life and my integrity and my energy into doing something that amounts to basically just a shell game?
Yeah.
Just passing somebody else's labor and vision off as my own. Hell no. But then I need to be super honest with people and say, this is what it's going to cost. This is how hard it's going to be. But if we do it, this is where we're going to get to. And then what I found is it's exactly that commitment to integrity. It's exactly that commitment to the long, hard road, but to a true destination, not a fake one.
Okay.
That makes people say, I want in. I want to be a part of this journey.
It's the story. It's the story. Like they want to be part of it.
They want to be, and they want to feel like everybody wants to feel like they're contributing to something of enduring and lasting value and legacy.
Yeah.
You're just passing off somebody else's product as your own. You might get a big payout, and God bless you if you do. I have no resentment. I have no jealousy about it. And I don't begrudge anybody who finds a way to make this business work, however they do it, as long as they're honest. But that's not for me. That's not a legacy. That doesn't say that's not a new story to tell. That's that colonialism of that Baghdad book market.
Yeah.
Taking somebody else's story and cheapening it or passing it off as my own.
Yeah.
That's appropriation. That's why people get pissed off at appropriation, because it's like, you didn't earn that. Your ancestors didn't earn that story.
Yeah.
And that's great that you appreciate it, but if you pass it off as your own, that's disrespect. So I don't want to do that. I want to tell a genuine story of this land that comes out of my life, that comes out of the communities that shaped me, and then put that into a glass and invite people into that story and enjoy it. And it turns out other people want to be part of it and they love how it tastes.
I love it. So alcohol, of course, is definitely like a personal experience and flavor profiles. But what, in your own words, is the flavor profile and story of Minnesota malt that really breaks down and is the foundation of Brother Justus?
So we make 3 distinctive products from All American single malt whiskey. So we have a silver whiskey, which is a barely aged. I call it barely aged, meaning it barely touches oak.
Yep.
And that's because I wanted to show off the flavor of the headwaters of our water and our plains, our barley, our soil. And so that is a clear whiskey, right? Remember, whiskey is beer rain. Rain falls from the sky. It doesn't fall amber from the sky. It falls clear from the sky. Whiskey starts clear, just like the rain.
Okay.
So we bottle it as a clear spirit, but it doesn't have it's not a neutral taste like vodka. It is full of like the wildflowers and the botanicals and the malt of the barley and that smell and flavor of the prairie grasses in September and October when they start to turn brown and that they're in the sun. You know what I mean? Like you get just that sense of purity and at the same time just vitality of the prairie. That's what we're really pushing for in there. The flavors of it are actually fruitier and floral, kind of peach and pear, which are some of the the trees that do grow up here and some of the fruits that come from up here. A little a little blueberry-like sort of sweetness, a flinty material, a flintiness, kind of like a unoaked Chardonnay, that kind of a white wine that has that flinty mineral kind of flavor.
Yeah.
And then this really rich malt, so a little hint of chocolate and cocoa nib at the base of it. That's the silver. People love it as just its own thing. It's the first unaged silver, or barely aged single malt whiskey in America. No one else makes this product. No one else is willing to just believes that you can just put just the distiller's craft of water and barley without the covering of oak
So is that still like enjoyed neat on the rocks, or is that more of like your cocktail?
It's both. There are some
Okay.
folks that's what they drink. They drink it neat because there's no other flavor like it that they can find in any other bottle in anywhere in the world. So,
Okay.
but most people that come through, it can replace any clear spirit. So it
Sure.
can replace your rum, replace your gin, replace your vodka, and it can replace your even your silver tequila. Um,
Mm.
and that's what I love about it, because it's balanced without being neutral. The flavors are all in balance, and it has elements of all of those different products in them, but they're balanced and they're composed. So when you make a cocktail with it, and you bring, like, you're going to make a tequila based cocktail, and you bring that lime and you bring that orange liqueur into it, the silver enhances and displays those flavors.
Okay.
It really shows those off. So,
See,
or if
my
you,
mind initially went to gin, like of the flavors you were describing. I was like, oh my God, this is like a gin cocktail all day.
amazing.
Yeah.
We do, most of our cocktails are either gin or rum based.
But gin is not my friend, so I would like that. Whiskey's my friend. Gin and I are not friends. So
we all have that person. We were maybe got a little too close, a little too fast
yeah,
early in our
it's
lives.
just we don't hang out.
Just don't hang out.
We just don't hang out.
That one, we love it. I always imagine, like, it solves a very specific problem that I think people have. You throw a party, you're having friends over, you want to make cocktails for everybody, but you know, this friend likes rum cocktails, this friend likes vodka cocktails, this one likes gin, that one likes tequila. And so you go to the liquor store and you buy 4 bottles, and then you bring them home, and you, like, maybe 2 or 3 fingers are gone from the top of the bottle, and then those bottles go up on the shelf and they just sit up there for another year or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, what the hell? This is such a waste. It's taking up my cabinet space. So I wanted to make a silver whiskey that could replace all those bottles. So instead of bringing 4 bottles home, you bring 1, but you make margarita, you make that Negroni, you make that even pina colada, you make the White Russian, all with this 1 bottle. And every one of your people says, oh my gosh, that's the best White Russian I've had. That's the best margarita I've had. So that's our goal with that. It's just to make life simple for people when they have cocktail parties. The next flavor profile is the American whiskey. That's the American single malt. This is the barrel aged. This is aged in new charred American white oak barrels. Again, we're innovators. This is the first whiskey that was fermented and distilled specifically for Minnesota grown white oak barrels. So if you imagine the life of a white oak tree in central Minnesota is very different from the life of a white oak tree in southern Missouri, which is where most of the white oak for whiskey barrels in the United States comes from.
Interesting.
700, 800 miles is a really different life further south. So a white oak tree up here has 3 months to grow, right? And so it doesn't have as wide of rings. Its rings are much narrower. And then it has to go through not just sub-freezing weather, but sub-zero weather.
Yeah.
And so it has denser, thicker bands around its growth rings that are full of tannins and vanillins, which act as a kind of antifreeze. And so a white oak tree that grows up here tastes completely different from a white oak tree further south. And we distilled our whiskey specifically for that, so that it's like walking through the central woods of Minnesota on a fall day with just a hint of campfire, like you're 200 yards from a campfire. So you're just getting that faint campfire smoke, but it's not in your face.
Okay.
So the flavors there are butterscotch.
All about that.
And buttery oak, kind of caramelized peach and pear. So not a fresh peach or a fresh pear. Instead, it's one that you've grilled or you've caramelized in the frying pan, and it has that richer, deeper stone fruit flavor. And then a really beautiful blend of baking spice at the end of clove, a little hint of black pepper, cinnamon, and a little nutmeg.
Yeah, you're describing fall in Minnesota like perfectly. Yeah.
Minnesota.
Yeah.
And this whiskey,
a Vikings win on the side. It's fine.
Yeah. So this whiskey is our flagship. It is the most versatile whiskey. It really achieves what I wanted to achieve, which is there's the world of Irish and Scotch whiskey on one side of the ocean, and then there's the world of bourbon and rye on the other side, and then there's the North in the middle. And so I wanted a whiskey that was friendly and bold and sweet like bourbon, right? So it has that butterscotch, it has that sweetness on the front. But then instead of just ending up in a cornfield, which for me is where every bourbon journey ends, every road, it's like your buddy who's like, let's go on a road trip. And they've got an awesome car. And you're like, yeah, let's go. And then they drive you to a cornfield and they're like, yeah, we're here. And I'm like, very cool. And then they're like, next weekend they take you to another cornfield. And it's like, I get it. I love it, but I need to go somewhere else. And Scotches, on the other hand, they take you to these really, really cool Highlands landscapes, but they're hard work. You know what I mean? Like you got to work your way there. So my idea was always like, I want the road trip in the cool car that's comfortable, but that takes you to a more interesting place, to a more complex, more layered, more unfolding journey than just the cornfield. And we've really achieved that in the American. And so we get Irish whiskey drinkers, Scotch drinkers, bourbon drinkers, rye drinkers, non-whiskey drinkers who just are like, who love it. And then our crowning achievement, and this is the one even more than the others that's going to make our international name, is the cold peated whiskey. Okay. So this is the very first whiskey in history, and still the only one with peat, not just peat from Minnesota bogs, but it is the only whiskey where you can actually taste peat. Every other peated whiskey, you only taste peat smoke.
And what does peat at its purest form taste like?
It is, in our whiskey, it is mushroom, nori, like the sushi grade seaweed.
Yeah.
And dark chocolate.
Wow. Okay.
Coming through this deep, rich caramel sort of center.
Love that.
So this incredible blend of savory, that mushroomy kind of an earthiness, with this hint of a distant ocean or an ancient seabed, and then this chocolate and caramel decadent dessert. There's literally nothing that exists like it. We actually have a patent pending in 6 countries on the
process. Helps to be a lawyer.
On the process we invented to make whiskey this way, with cold natural peat.
Cool.
And it's going to, I think it's going to revolutionize the category, actually, because not only does it have flavors that you cannot find anywhere else, unlike traditional peat where you dig up essentially a 10,000-year-old carbon sink, right? All that carbon is being stored in the structure of the plant, in the ground. You dig that out of the ground, you set it on fire, and you turn it into greenhouse gas and air pollution in order to get a trace flavoring on your barley before you distill it into a whiskey. That's a flavor that most people don't like.
Yeah.
We are always keeping it in solid form. It never gets turned into a gas. It's never burned. It goes back into the ground when we're done with it. And we use a fraction, a decimal of the amount of peat per volume that is used in the traditional method. And we're partnering with a peat producer in central Minnesota from Aiken County. We're actually adding to the new living peatlands in Minnesota with every bottle we make, because they're actually taking the peat out of a farm field that had been a living bog 100 years ago, but had been drained and ditched and turned into a field. And they're now harvesting the peat out, and then in the excavation, the area that's been excavated, letting the natural water table rise up and then planting native peatland species.
Okay.
So we're actually improving the ecological health of the country and of the land, and we hope want to build people that connection to the peatlands.
Yeah.
And just how important this landscape and this ecosystem is to the overall health of the planet.
Okay, I have one final question for you to kind of wrap this all up. It's a little complex, but what thus far in your entrepreneurial journey, what has Brother Justus and creating this brand taught you about Minnesota that you didn't know before? or the story of Minnesota?
Yeah, I think for me, it's been, I had these inclinations. I had these impressions and intuitions from growing up here. But so I knew something about this landscape. I knew something about this history, but it was all just sort of vague sense.
Okay.
I think since then, I think I really start to understand Minnesota in a much longer time frame, that Minnesota is the heart of the country. It's the ecological heart of the country. That's undisputed. Like that's a fact. We don't have to say oofta or try to get people excited about hot dish to say this is a real claim to importance that's made. And that even more than I understood before, we're a land of migrants. You know, this is a land where people come to carrying their stories, carrying their peoplehood and their identity from other places. And that actually started with the Lakota and the Anishinaabe and the Ojibwe. They're migrants into this land. They all came from the Great Lakes region. First the Lakota and then the Ojibwe came. So even our First Nations people are themselves migrants who have a longer than view of the stewardship of the land. And that every new people, so the Minnesota identity starts with the land, and then it's added to with every new people that comes with their story. And then it's up to all of us. And I think the best of Minnesota tradition is when we honor those stories and we find and unite around a common set of stories that has to do with our land. And that means, you know, starting with honoring Lakota and Anishinaabe land, but then each new wave of migration continues to add, and it's like the layers of flavor in a barrel that just continues to season and make this, I think, the most delicious place to live.
I love that. Well, Phil, thank you so much for coming on the Come Up, and like your story is just amazing. Like, really enjoyed hearing all about it.
It was really fun to talk to you because it was really you track and you make so many connections so quickly, and then ask such great stimulating questions. So I appreciate you. I appreciate your listeners too.
Yeah.
And I hope they enjoyed this journey.
I know, and come see the beautiful distillery in Northeast Minneapolis.
So next time when you come for Street Fair, you know,
Thanksgiving, I'll probably be back in Thanksgiving. That'll probably be the next time I'm there, and it'll be nice and toasty.
Absolutely. Well, I'll come by and bring some friends, and I'll give you guys a little tour and walk you through our whiskeys.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll do a little like behind the scenes purple banter.
That'd be awesome.
That'd be awesome. I'd love that.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
All right, Phil, thank you so much.